we've got a bunch of enemies now that hate this country, and some are internal. So it should cause us to go, hey, well, wait a minute now. We need to really look at hardening up our grids.
Hey there, welcome to 2023 and our second Hot Zone podcast of the year. I've got my good friend Tim Miller on with us today. Tim is a former Secret Service agent, former all kinds of things, and he's a Marine Lieutenant Colonel and now runs Lionheart International Services Group, doing training and consulting for everything from church security to facility security to corporate security. Tim, thanks for coming on with us.
Chuck, it's an honor to be with you. By the way, thanks for your great reporting from Ukraine. Really appreciate that honest assessment of what's going on in the ground over there.
Well, I'm looking forward to getting back to someplace a little bit warmer, and that'll happen in the next few days. So I just wanted to talk to you about some of the things that are going on in America right now. It's a scary time. One of the things that I experienced in Ukraine was that every day Russia is sending missiles and drones over Kyiv and other cities across that country, trying to knock out the power grid. They're weaponizing energy in order to try to make people so miserable that they'll just give up. Now, it's having the opposite effect on people over there. I can guarantee you that, because people keep saying, if we surrender to Russia, we'll still have no power and we'll have Russia. So we might as well have no power and no Russia. So that, their strategy is backfiring a little bit. However, it did get me thinking about some of the real reasons for the war in Ukraine, which I think revolves a lot around energy, both natural gas, petroleum, and electricity. And just very quickly to explain what I mean by that, Ukraine has been a net exporter of energy for a long time, but all of that energy was tied into the Soviet or former Soviet power grid. And so that power grid is every bit as vulnerable, as fragile as the power grid in the United States, if not more so. Ukraine wanted to transfer their power grid over to the European power grid because it's more stable and they don't like Russia. And Russia kept saying, don't do that, because Russia desperately needs the power that gets generated in Ukraine. But Ukraine actually took the first step to making that switch on February 24th. And 4 hours later, the Russians invaded that country. One of their first major objectives was the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, which was the power plant that they first switched over to the European power grid. So that has made us all look a little harder at the vulnerabilities, the national security implications of the U.S. power grid. Talk to me a little bit about that. What do you think are the national security implications of a stable and robust power grid here in the United States?
Well, Chuck, it's interesting. This is not something new for the U.S. government to consider. Back when I was working on the staff of the Secretary of Homeland Security, we had major concerns for how vulnerable our power grid is. And quite honestly, it's gotten worse since then. The fact that we're seeing these test attacks, which I do believe they're test attacks, underscore how important it is that the U.S. look afresh and anew at how do we keep sustained power in the country. Because think about it. The attacks we've seen have been overly simple. People with rifles shooting into transformers. In one case in North Carolina, it was 40,000 people lost power. Well, the U.S., based on its economy, can't function without power. So, obviously Russia is putting into practice what others are thinking, and that, hey, how easy is it to take down a nation if you, for a significant period of time, reduce their power? It's scary.
So we don't know at the moment whether or not these attacks that we've seen in the last month in the United States are terrorism or just vandalism or what. Does it really matter, though?
It doesn't, Chuck, because, it's kind of like school shootings. When one does a person mentally ill, whatever, attacks a school, it always encourages others who are going, hey, that's pretty easy. And oh, by the way, Columbine did this. I want to do an attack that's even more. And, Chuck, we've got a bunch of enemies now that hate this country, and some are internal. So it should cause us to go, hey, well, wait a minute now. We need to really look at hardening up our grids. It is a big deal, and you're the only person I've heard really talking about this.
Well, so, we've got 410,000 miles. They say 19 times around the Earth is our power grid. The power lines that we have just in the United States would stretch 19 times around the Earth. We've got 79,000 power substations that are essentially unguarded. I mean, these things don't have much in the way of security. What would it take to actually harden our power grid to make it secure from these kinds of attacks?
Well, Chuck, that's the point. And the point 20 years ago is the point today. There needs to be more redundancy. That the unfortunate part is we are exceptionally vulnerable, because if you take out key pieces of the grid along the way, you're shutting down massive areas. And so that should be the question everybody's asking, not just how do we harden up the existing structure, but how do we make more redundancy in the structures to where you can, like in other systems, you could easily have another system carry the load for a limited period of time. You look at what's going on in the West Coast, with the power overburdened by increasing population. Hey, this is a big deal for the country, and I think you're wise to raise the question, what do we need to do? Well, in the interim, we definitely need to look at making some of our key facilities way more hardened than they are. And then, but the real issue is, how do we create redundancy within the system to make sure that if one element fails, our whole grids are not going down?
That's a very good answer. If you look at liken it to computers, if you have one central server and somebody takes out that server, the whole computer goes down. But if you've got a distributed network of servers that is spread all over the world, it's impossible for somebody to take down all of those all at once. And we could do that with the U.S. power grid. There are these microturbine generators that can create power. It's about the size of a refrigerator. They run on just about anything. They practically run on cat piss. I mean, they run on methane. They run on diesel. They run on gasoline. They run on substandard natural gas. Whatever they want. They are very low maintenance. And each one of these is about the size of a refrigerator. It creates power for 4 or 5 houses. You could put those in across the country, network them all together so that if one or two goes down, the other ones take up the slack. And that's what you're talking about. But in the meantime, let me ask you this. There's a power substation right at the end of my street. And that may, living under all those power lines may explain a lot about me. But if you look at that, there's a chain link fence around it, and that's it. What would it take? I mean, is it even feasible to take 79,000 of these things across the United States and upgrade their security? Because some of them are in very remote areas. You can't watch all those things. You can't have a guard at all of those things. What would it even take to make those things hardened, as you say, to the point where they couldn't be shot at from a mile away with a deer rifle?
Yeah, Chuck, the good news in this is there is evolving technology, ballistic material that can be applied. Trying to make them all an armed camp, it's just not going to happen. It's cost prohibitive. But applying materials to the actual transformers. And it's interesting, Chuck, you really bring a great point, because Americans are so disconnected. We're so used to having everything work, power outages go out, oh, it'll be a day or so. But can you imagine, in the middle of that blizzard that we all just went through, having a strategic strike against key power substations? Well, Houston, you got a problem, because your crews can't get there and people are going to freeze to death. A number of people did freeze to death. So to answer your question, I think we've got to be creative as a country. We have to start identifying, the weaknesses in our infrastructure. And by the way, power's not the only one. I mean, people have to have water. People, so it's time. We just saw, in case we were wondering that terrorism went away, we saw New Year's, a machete wielding, ISIS, Taliban, whoever he was, attacking 3 police officers. Here we go again. And I think that sometimes, we can be sound asleep and we don't wake up until December 7th, 1941, where the surprise attack occurs. I pray that's not the case for power, because it will result in tremendous loss of life in the winter, as we're seeing in Ukraine.
Yeah, National Geographic did a study about that several years ago, and they made a documentary about power outages. And they said that if the power went out nationwide for even 10 days, you're looking at something like 4 million people dead, because there are people who rely on it for insulin and for medical devices and things like that they have to have it to live. So it is a big deal. One of the things you mentioned was applying materials to these some of these critical nodes, the ultra high voltage transformers that are very difficult to replace. You've talked a lot with me about Gigacrete before. It's this new technology. Give us just a quick 1-minute rundown of what Gigacrete is, and I wonder, would it work on if we applied it to some of these ultra high voltage transformers?
It absolutely would work. And Gigacrete is, one of those things developed by a mad scientist who, was at a lab, and he started looking at trying to build homes that were hurricane resistant. And he came up with, the only way I'll know how to describe it, is like the old plaster material. And basically he was able to condense this plaster at the cellular level to where it became a bonding agent that's incredibly strong. And although he built it for hurricane survival, he began to notice ballistic properties. And so he began to, test it ballistically. And a good example is with about 4 inches of this material, which could be applied because it's like a plaster. You could build a cast around it. It has demonstratedly stopped up to, 308. And even beyond. There was some testing with some steel that were stopping 50 cal. So the only reason I point that out is there's evolving technology right now, today. It's not in the sky theory, that we as a nation, should be looking at, because if we leave them the way they are, as we have seen, this is not theory, a very frustrated person hates America with a 308 AP round. He can put rounds in there, and now you got an entire system down. Well, then you get into the backlog and think about it. The supply chain is weak. I mean, it's the perfect storm, getting the replacement parts. And, you can do it for 1 or 2 or 3. But what if it's 30? What if it's 50? And what if this is a systematic attack against the very nation itself? And that's where I think you're wise to raise the issue. So, again, I don't want to go into specifics, but there are a very limited number of key locations that, if struck significantly, could result in power not being restored for up to 9 months. And that was the horror. Remember the East Coast blackouts that we went through? And that was, 2003, 2004. Nobody really understood. And then they said, well, it was a bird. And okay, whatever. The reality is this. That caused a deep dive. And that caused a whole lot of concern and fear. Again, the answer is redundancy, because that antiquated system, after World War II, has not significantly been upgraded. And so now you're looking at, interestingly enough, to show you how vulnerable it is, what do they do in Florida? Prior to a hurricane, they put thousands of trucks out and they cut trees. Why? Because something as simple as that can cause area-wide blackout. Well, really? Why aren't we burying our power? Why aren't we doing things that would truly make a difference? Chuck, just to, kind of bring this back around, 20 years ago, I was on a task force with Homeland Security as part of the Secretary's office, and we were looking at exactly what's happening today. And unfortunately, not a lot's changed. We really haven't done the things, surprise of surprise, that would have completely protected the grid. Again, can't underscore how devastating to our nation it would be for businesses not to have power, for people that are depending on respirators not to have power, for weather. And you know what? I hate to say it, Americans aren't typically thinking about these things on their own and preparing in advance. We just watched how many people, 25 people, freeze to death in their cars, knowing the storm was coming, knowing it was projected. And I'm not blaming them. I'm just saying that being prepared for events like this is not something Americans are used to. So, Chuck, I'm really excited about a new podcast we're doing. As you know, with Lionheart, and you've been so critical to our team to help us along this journey. We have, really world-renowned experts, retired guys from the FBI and Secret Service, and we are going to launch actually this week a podcast called Real Security on YouTube, where we just help people think through the issues that are going on in our country, a variety of issues related to security. In other words, we'll talk about emergency preparedness, what every family should be thinking about. We'll talk about medical emergencies, what every family should be thinking about. But we'll also go into some of the crime we're seeing, carjackings and home invasions. And the goal is to provide real security experts to deal with real security issues and hopefully help people, families, prepare with real security solutions. So we're thrilled. Our team is thrilled. This is something we're really doing from the heart to help people, because what I know is this, and I know, something you said to me has really, really hit me hard. And that's when you said after coming back from Kyiv that you felt safer in Kyiv than you do in major U.S. cities. Wow. That spoke volumes to me. And I thought, our team's got to get out here and help people prepare. How to think, how to prepare. If you're carrying a weapon, some things you need to think about. Because I think at the end of the day, and I hope I'm wrong, but I suspect things are going to get a whole lot more challenging in the days ahead.
How do people find it?
It's YouTube, Real Security Podcast is the name of the channel. We'll be putting out social media and everything else associated with it. But if they go to YouTube and just look up Real Security Podcast, they'll find us and our team. And, then if they want to just jump on the LionheartSecurityTeam.com website, you'll see all about us, because we got a great group of guys. And I'm thankful for your wisdom and input, Chuck. You've been a friend for many years. I can't believe that I'm admitting that an Army guy is mentoring me. I hope there are no Marines listening.
That's okay. The Marines are busy eating crayons. Hey, great talking to you, Tim, and Happy New Year to you and your great family. I'm looking forward to what God has for us this year. It's going to be a great year in 2023, I pray.